All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 28, Post-War Prosperity and Cold War Fears, 1945 to 1960. We'll be looking at Section 1, Challenges of Peacetime. So recall last chapter, 27, was all about World War II. And so when World War II came to an end, the nation needed to demobilize, which is, transfer back from a war economy, you might say, back to like a normal economy. And so, of course, one of the questions, or one of the large questions was, well, what do you do with now the reduced military? You had something like 12 million soldiers who had been mobilized to fight World War II. How do you bring them home? What sort of impact is it going to have on things like jobs? What are they going to do for work? You simply can't just unleash 12 million men on the American economy and expect, good results. So how to sort of tackle this problem is, of course, one of the main issues here. There's also a question about layoffs due to the reduced economy because the war is no longer going. So if we look at war-related jobs, which were responsible for much of the employment during the war years, these war-related jobs are disappearing. You don't need to build the bullets, the planes, the tanks, everything that was required for the war. So these are the things that the nation is facing once the war is over. And one solution to this is the GI Bill, right? The GI Bill is a solution to demobilization, specifically to the reduced or returning military. So one thing first that the United States did was it didn't bring all of the soldiers back home at once. In fact, demobilization was gradual, a million, rather than all at once. But the GI Bill also helped. This was passed by Congress to give benefits to servicemen, right? People who served in the military, which included unemployment compensation. So this would help ease the job market. You wouldn't have a lot of jobless former veterans wandering the streets causing problems, but also providing for tuition, which is the ability to go to college, which would take veterans, off of the job market, would make them students, but would also give them, skills that were required for social mobility. Now, the benefits from the GI Bill weren't always equal. So, for example, there was racial discrimination in some cases. We have to remember that some colleges were segregated. So, for example, if you were an African-American soldier who served in the war, you may receive the GI benefit for tuition, but you'd be very limited in terms of where you could actually go and use that, only at all-black colleges, for example. And also discrimination based off of sexual orientation, that a number of gays and lesbians were discharged from the military and therefore not eligible for these benefits. So it wasn't always equal. In addition to the demobilization of U.S. forces, also was the return of the Japanese, the end of internment. And many found that when they returned home, that a lot of their belongings, their homes, their farms, etc., were gone. That their neighbors had inhabited their belonging or their homes, that their farms had been repossessed by the banks, and they were really returning home empty-handed. It is actually quite a tragic story for the thousands of Japanese who returned back home for nothing. Meanwhile, in the political area, President Truman pushed his fair deal. The fair deal is President Truman's domestic agenda. And really what he wants is a continuation of the New Deal, right? Remember, Truman was Roosevelt's vice president when President Roosevelt passed away in 1945. Truman then became the president. Truman was the president responsible for dropping the atomic weapon. So he wants to keep the New Deal alive by promoting and pushing forward more social programs and social policies that were very similar to the New Deal. However, one thing is different, and that is the way that Truman addresses civil rights. He addresses civil rights, that is the status of African Americans in the country, more so than any other president really since maybe Abraham Lincoln or Ulysses S. Grant. The Fair Deal also includes a Presidential Committee on Civil Rights. These are advisors to Truman. And he wants civil rights legislation to be part of the New Deal. So the Fair Deal includes civil rights. As we'll learn here in a moment, Truman's Fair Deal essentially is resisted by Congress. So his Fair Deal never really gets passed. Civil rights is part of it, but there's also other aspects of it that Congress simply just won't pass. But without being able to get any progress on civil rights through the legislation, Truman takes to executive order by desegregating the military, right? So this is Truman via executive order. So World War II becomes the last U.S. war in which black and white soldiers fight separately. In all future wars, black and white soldiers will fight side by side with one another, thanks to Truman's executive order. And so another example of congressional resistance is the Taft-Hartley Act, which is an anti-union act. President Truman actually vetoes this. But as is with the Constitution, Congress has the power to override the veto with 2/3, and that's exactly what happens. So even though Truman's Fair Deal was quite ambitious and did resemble the New Deal in a lot of ways, congressional resistance to it and the ability for Congress to even override the veto of the president ultimately ruled the day.